Maria Calavera has been on my mind recently. More specifically, I've been thinking about her role in the RWBY narrative. She was introduced in Volume 6 as RWBY's silver-eyed mentor, which I find a few issues with. From a writer's perspective, RWBY already has two believably qualified mentor figures. There's Uncle Qrow, who was teammates with RWBY's silver-eyed mother, Summer Rose, and Ozpin, who points out RWBY's silver eyes in the first chapter of the show, implying right away that he knows much more about them. He also happens to be centuries old thanks to his reincarnation ability, and I don't think it would shatter anyone's suspension of disbelief if he happened to have knowledge pertinent to silver eyes. It's also worth mentioning that Ozpin's reincarnation conveniently keeps him in the plot. This leaves Maria feeling pretty redundant in the story. Ozpin's behind-the-curtain knowledge and Qrow's special relationship to RWBY are perfect setups, but ultimately they're both ignored and replaced with a completely new and even more underdeveloped character. It wastes Ozpin's and Qrow's potential and reduces Maria to a one-note plot device. Despite my hangups, I don't think Maria should be removed entirely. She is a genuinely fun and quirky character. So the question is, where does she belong? As it turns out, I believe she would better serve as Qrow's mentor instead of RWBY's, for one simple reason: his bad luck semblance.
It's always there, whether I like it or not. I bring misfortune. Comes in real handy when I'm fighting an enemy, but it makes it a little hard on friends and family.
Qrow's semblance is passive and mostly out of his control. The random nature of his bad luck is the reason why he distances himself from loved ones, and is also the apparent cause of his rampant alcoholism. Clearly, it creates issues for him. But say his semblance could be controlled. Who could be the catalyst for his training arc? Unfortunately, Qrow's semblance is beyond both RWBY's and Ozpin's help. Ozpin would no doubt share Qrow's wary attitude, having decided a long time ago that it's simply a passive semblance with properties that can't be helped. I should clarify why Ozpin's extensive old age knowledge would be beneficial to RWBY but not Qrow. Though rare, silver eyes are historically reoccurring and integral to Ozpin's plan, unlike Qrow's semblance. This means that Ozpin would have had the desire and the opportunity to study one over the other. Silver eyes have been around since presumably the dawn of man, while Qrow and his unique semblance have only existed for 40 or so years. I also believe that Ozpin would have already helped Qrow if he were able to. I don't disagree with the idea of RWBY playing a part in Qrow's emotional recovery, since she's obviously a positive influence in his life. She's simply too young and inexperienced to give any advice on his semblance. Enter Maria, an outsider with a fresh set of eyes. Or in this instance, no eyes at all. Unlike Ozpin, she wouldn't automatically assume Qrow is a lost cause. And unlike RWBY, Maria would have the life experience to offer new insight and advice. Besides, pairing up Qrow and Maria's personalities would be entertaining on its own. I imagine their dynamic being similar to that of Yusuke and Genkai from Yu Yu Hakusho, though Maria would be much more lighthearted and playful in her approach.
Are you happy now, Grandma?
I can never tell what's worse, your aim or your pride in it.
With all that said, I'll go through the basic storyline for my proposed Maria and Qrow training arc. After escaping a certain life-threatening situation, Qrow decides to leave Team Ranger, and blames his semblance for almost killing them. He leaves for Beacon, but is seriously injured during his journey, and gets lost in a dense forest. He wanders and eventually comes across a secluded cottage in the woods, and meets its occupants, an elderly woman and her grandson. Alternatively, Qrow is so badly injured that he can't move, and is instead found by the grandson and brought back to the cottage. You can probably guess who the elderly woman is. As for the grandson, I'm toying with the idea of it being Oscar, or at least having his appearance. Oscar is another character in the canon story that feels redundant to me, but that doesn't mean I want to completely axe him. Placing Maria and Oscar in a codependent parent-child relationship would give them more dimensions, and again, opposing personalities could foster entertaining character interactions. Oscar would still be the same kind-hearted yet timid farm boy, only this time he lives with a fiery grandmother that dishes out point-blank insults and the occasional mischievous prank. Tyrion could be the reason Qrow gets injured at the start of the training arc. I imagine the fight being similar if not identical to the fight in Volume 4, minus Team Ranger. For instance, Tyrion can have the same motive to kidnap RWBY, which would give Qrow a stronger reason to return to Team Ranger. On the other hand, stopping Tyrion could easily overshadow Qrow's concern with his bad luck semblance, so this plot point is going to need some more work if it is included. Continuing the story, the woman and the grandson offer to keep Qrow until he's healed, but Qrow strongly refuses, knowing his semblance could harm them. Either through the old woman's persistence or Qrow succumbing to his injuries, he ultimately ends up staying in the cottage. The old woman introduces herself as Maria, and doesn't understand why Qrow refuses to stay. He explains his semblance and its dangers, to which she mocks him and even asks if he's really a huntsman, as she can't believe he hasn't learned to control his semblance by now. Qrow obviously doesn't think this is funny, and shares that his semblance has unintentionally killed people in the past. Maria still believes Qrow's semblance can be controlled, and offers to help him, seeing it as an interesting challenge not only for Qrow, but for herself as well. Qrow would still dismiss her, until Maria offers some kind of wager to convince him to cooperate, or even threatens him by claiming he won't be able to leave the forest if he can't control his semblance. Maria's semblance is undecided for the time being. It's definitely not going to be reflexes. I do imagine it being similar to a confusion or an illusion semblance, which could alter Qrow's mental state and prevent him from escaping the woods, though something much simpler like temporary paralysis could work as well. At the very least, Maria's semblance should reflect her impish personality. I also think Maria should straight up be blind with no biotech aid like she has in the show. For me, this seems a more whimsical yet logical design choice. A secluded woman living in a forest probably wouldn't bother with high-tech Atlas gadgetry anyway, and it could be a nod to the blind witch from the Hansel and Gretel fairy tale, who also lived in a secluded cottage in the woods. I was split on whether or not Maria should still have silver eyes. The implications of silver eyes eventually causing blindness would add an interesting risk-reward to RWBY's use of them, but I do worry that a silver-eyed Maria would only convolute the overall story. This isn't necessarily a given, but for the sake of tightening up the story, I believe it would be best if she didn't have the silver eyes. So Qrow begrudgingly agrees to Maria's training. And it's going to sound really hokey, but it boils down to Qrow learning to focus on his semblance and accept it as a part of himself, as opposed to trying to ignore it and letting it run rampant. I've heard other RWBY fans theorize that Qrow's negative opinion of his semblance only fuels his inability to control it. And I think they're onto something. It seems analogous of a parent ignoring a disruptive child simply because they believe the child cannot be helped. A willful ignorance that only feeds into a never-ending loop of bad behavior. Maria would need to uproot Qrow's deep-seated self-loathing and help him reevaluate his semblance in a more constructive light. Again, to go along with her trickster-like personality, she would definitely see his semblance as something beneficial, since it causes others misfortune. This could be another reason to include potentially Oscar grandson, since Maria raising Oscar could parallel Qrow training to control his semblance. I realize that Qrow's training to become one with his semblance is incredibly vague, so I'm gonna try and be a little more specific here. Qrow's inability to control his semblance should be consequential of some past traumatic event. To get down to brass tacks, Qrow should blame himself and his semblance for the death of RWBY's mother. That isn't to say that he did kill Summer, but it's important that he at least perceives himself as partially responsible. Perhaps during Team Stark's tragic mission, Qrow's semblance began to act erratically, and post Summer's death he couldn't help but blame himself, haunted by that singular question, what if I wasn't there? Maybe Ty and Raven began to suspect his semblance as well, either out of reasonable deduction or simply because their grief craved something to blame for their teammate's death. Qrow's paranoia and the lack of support from his own teammates would build upon his doubts until he began to hate himself. Understandably, this would drive a wedge between Qrow and his own semblance, deteriorating his control over it. Whether or not Qrow's bad luck was really responsible, he can't forgive himself, and he strongly believes that RWBY wouldn't forgive him either if she ever found out. This could explain why Qrow decided to leave Team Ranger at the start of the training arc, since it reminded him too much of the events leading up to Summer's death. He wouldn't want the past to repeat itself again. During their training, Maria would come to the conclusion that Qrow not only needs to forgive himself, but that he also craves forgiveness from his niece. Before Qrow leaves the cottage, Maria would strongly urge him to seek closure with RWBY, which would then give Qrow full control over his semblance and complete his training. Qrow wouldn't think full control would be worth telling RWBY the truth that he may be the reason her mother died, but he would be forced to realize that if he doesn't control his semblance, then something like Summer's death could happen again. The risk of Qrow's semblance hurting more people is leveraged with telling RWBY the truth about her mother, and it's up to Qrow to make that choice. Ultimately, it would be RWBY's choice to forgive Qrow, should he decide to tell her. I think what bothers me most about Maria being RWBY's mentor is that it's all to serve as a power-up, the Silver Eyes, the Deus Ex Machina, and that's pretty much it. But as Qrow's mentor, Maria could trigger major character development for both Qrow and RWBY. Their power-ups would just be the icing on the cake. I understand if these changes may seem a little drastic, or just downright silly and overblown. I'm kind of prone to ideas like that. But it's not much of a stretch to say that Rooster Teeth has a habit of overloading RWBY's cast. Having a big cast isn't inherently bad, but it can easily lead to some pretty bad bloat if handled poorly, and leave many characters such as Maria, Qrow, and Ozpin, to name a few, feeling half-baked, unfocused, and underdeveloped. So please let me know what you think. I just kind of woke up with this idea at the forefront of my mind, and thought I'd share my grand epiphany, or whatever this is. I'm even considering making it into a comic, but we'll see, I don't know. Whatever becomes of this, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for listening. And I would like to thank my amazing patrons Kara Grace and the man with 3 first names for their patience and continued support. You guys have been awesome. And if anyone watching is interested in commissions or becoming a patron, there are links in the description. Thank you.